Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's an Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's an attorney, and he's also the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. And we have Ms. Joy Mosley, who's the Associate Vice President of Government and Strategic Relations for the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, if you're a person of faith who works, it's likely you probably had to attend, or maybe at least you have heard about some type of mandated diversity, equity, and inclusion training. The term of art that we hear all the time is called DEI. And it seems as though now that we are working in a society where that seems to be an issue that's taking more precedent, we're finding that there are some questions as wondering, maybe I can get an accommodation to not have to engage in that training. And maybe that accommodation may come because that training may want me to engage in a thought process or what some would call a cancer culture of some sort, where it expects me to agree to engage in something that violates my religious beliefs. In many instances, we are told that if you don't engage in this activity, then maybe you won't be able to work here. But there seems to be an opportunity that's starting to be crafted that regarding some recent changes in the law, it seems that individuals can actually go about deciding that I may not have to do this training because it violates, quote unquote, my religious beliefs or my purpose for what I'd like to be doing from a religious standpoint. You know, Andrew, when I take a look at what's happening here, on one hand, we seem to want to look at society as ways that we can figure out how to peacefully get along with all groups. But on the other hand, it seems as though there's always seems to be an undercurrent that's thinking, well, maybe I don't have to do certain things in this society and I can, quote unquote, exempt myself or get an accommodation for religious beliefs. It begs the question as to whether or not people sometimes are using their religious beliefs to support something, or maybe you want to use it to engage in discrimination of some sort. You know, when you hear about these type of matters, I mean, as someone who's kind of also working in the university side and writing books and things of that nature, how do you kind of handle an understanding of this and helping even the public to understand it a little better?
Yeah, this issue comes to the fine line, I think, of the division between church and state. So the opportunity for this Supreme Court case of Groff v. DeJoy is related to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of that, technically, that says you can claim a religious exemption, an employee, but it can't place undue hardship on the employer. For a long time, up until very recently, that was interpreted as basically inconveniencing the employer in any way. It really limited in some ways the opportunities for religious exemptions. This new Supreme Court case said, which was specifically a postal worker who was starting to be required to work on Sundays when he wanted to go to church because of Amazon deliveries, actually. And the accommodation wasn't given to him, and then he was reprimanded and he quit and then sued for this. The difficulty is there seems to be, at least to me, a pretty vast difference between a person who cannot attend their religious worship services and someone who doesn't want to go to a meeting where stuff is said that they don't like. If you've ever been to a workplace meeting, right, there's a whole lot of stuff that we may not agree with, we don't have. There's a lot of distance between those. Now, when people are being fired and they're being moved through, there is a lot of difficulty in the process. But at some point, we also have to get to something beyond punishing people for their religious beliefs or using my religious beliefs to not have to do something, or in problematic cases, discriminating, right? I have a religious right to discriminate. That, to me, on the faith side of this, is the most problematic part. But the politics side is gets really messy in these events because it's made up of people, and we don't always give the due credit to others.
I think it's interesting that post Groff, people have said, oh, this expands our rights to request an accommodation, to not have to attend this kind of training. But there actually has been, EEOC cases that have gone through and found that it's not a violation for employers to require employees to attend this training, that it doesn't conflict with religious beliefs, and that employers can show that it would be an undue hardship to exempt employees from attending this training, because they actually have Title VII obligations to provide this training to prevent harassment and discrimination based on these other protected classes. So even though this hasn't gone through the courts, it has gone through the EEOC process, and we've at least seen there that there's a hesitancy to say, yes, we're going to grant this religious accommodation to you to not have to attend training, where all we're doing, at least in some instances, is providing information. We're not asking you to agree with this information or to change your beliefs, but just to sit and listen to the information that's being provided.
Well, here's the other interesting thing. People who want to kick against diversity training, especially using a religious reason to do so, they forget the Bible is a diversity training manual. Because in the Bible, God tells us to love our enemies. In other words, be careful how you treat people, even those that you don't like. It tells us not to judge. It tells us that God lets the rain fall on the just and the unjust. So the whole idea that my religion somehow precludes me from having to sit through all of this really on its face is disingenuous, because the consistent message of Scripture is it doesn't matter what a person believes or doesn't believe. You are under divine obligation to be careful how you treat them. And that's why I have an issue with a lot of the movements that we see today, because they seem to be saying, if you believe this, it's okay to treat you good. But if you don't believe this, or if you somehow don't fit in this particular category, then it's okay to treat you any old kind of way. And well, sorry, sucks to be you. That's the problem. That's the problem.
I really want, and I think we all do on this call, strong religious protections in law. And if we water those down ourselves by claiming things that don't really have a religious nexus, but more of sometimes a partisan nexus, that's actually not a religious claim. And then we get into problems like Jennifer was mentioning, the EEOC adjudicating these and saying, well, that doesn't violate your religious beliefs. That's not EEOC's place to say that. That's entangling that gets into all sorts of problems when a government is saying what your religious beliefs are or not. But we have to be careful not to put ourselves in that position by not claiming something that actually, that's more partisan or more ideological based, not religiously based.
Joy, let me follow up with that. When you think about some of the work that you do with Christian colleges and universities, could you imagine being in a situation where there's a training that's happening there that's supposed to be dealing with something along these lines, and somebody tells you that it violates my religious beliefs in order to be able to get training at this religious institution? It almost starts to look as though we're getting to a point where it seems like the tail is wagging the dog as it relates to some of these issues. And I think the point that you just made about how do you draw the line between what's a religious issue and what's not seems to be really the question that's at heart.
Right. And I think we as religious employees ourselves need to be circumspect about ensuring that we're being forthright about what things we just don't like versus actually have a religious objection to. Because what I don't want is for the actual religious concerns to be watered down or be diluted because of these. I think of COVID and some of the vaccine mandates. Like some people do have a religious objection in terms of how the vaccines were created and some of that, but some don't. They just didn't think they should be forced to take it or didn't want to, and we're claiming a religious exemption. So I think we would need to be careful not to set a pattern of excusing or rationalizing behavior, and that happens across the board. And like you mentioned, Orlin, it can happen at Christian colleges too, unfortunately.
You know, Jennifer, when I look at some of these circumstances, and, you know, sometimes we do forget that some of these quote unquote exemptions are really a ticket to discriminate. And where do we find ourselves drawing the line between quote unquote starting to really engage more in discrimination as opposed to finding yourself in a position where somebody's religious accommodation needs to take place, and sometimes trying to figure out when your religion is actually meeting your politics. And now we start talking about partisan activities and cultural beliefs as opposed to religious beliefs, where it sometimes is so difficult to parse. You know, how do we manage through that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. You know, I mentioned the one case before the EEOC, but there's actually another one where a father and son said that not only did they object for religious reasons to the, not to LGBTQ training, but also to any kind of training on anti-racism. They saw that as anti-woke training or woke training, and they objected to it on, again, religious grounds. And again, you know, you go down this really dangerous path when you start to say, well, anything that I object to is actually a religious objection. And as Joy said, we saw this take place in some instances during COVID as well, where there's some individuals who really did have sincerely held religious objections. And then other people who just said, my personal objection is also my religious objection. And there's that confusion between the two.
Well, you know, Andrew, you've written a book where part of the title talks about, you know, the making of an American religion. How do we even determine whether what you're talking about is really a religion or not? Or is it simply you put a tag on it, and the way we're set up, whatever you call it, it is what it is?
Yeah. That's the real difficulty of all this, right? Exactly what Lawrence said, I would second. The objection to some of this stuff from a faith perspective, I don't understand in any way, really, right? If someone wants me to exchange one word I know for another word I know, and I will not do that, that seems to be the least I can do for another human being, right? I mean, some of this stuff that I won't do, it's against my faith. It does seem to be more about the politics side of it and the cultural posturing than it is about what I consider, at least, authentic Christian faith. But the difficulty is we don't all have the same faith, probably on this same panel, right? We disagree on things. Hopefully the core of humanity and God and people made in the image of God, right? Those things keep us together. But how do you parse exactly what is someone's personal belief or their political slant or their religious belief? It's really difficult to say as an outsider. So as a legal practice, it's really messy.
So Lawrence, I'm going to give you the last word on this. So now you're trying to run a church. You're trying to determine how you can help people. But then there's somebody that says, you know what, but that's against my religious beliefs. And what you're doing violates how they think they should be treated from a religious perspective. How do we deal with that?
I believe God gives us the model for the best way forward, because what he does, though he clearly has a best practices, at the end of the day, he gives us space to do what we think we should do. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to answer to him, whether we're right, whether we're wrong. But I think that tolerance and that willingness to let other people operate is what makes us an effective society.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word, and I couldn't agree more. Understanding how we can peacefully coexist with our neighbor still should be what I would call the priority of the land. You know, there's a case that's recently been out there, which is called MC and JC versus Indiana Department of Child Services. And then the state of Indiana, what they did is they launched an investigation that started back in 2021 into the home of Mary and Jeremy Cox, Catholic parents who would not refer to their son using pronouns and a name inconsistent with his biological sex. The state court then removed their child from their home and never returned them to their custody, even after dismissing all the allegations of any type of abuse or neglect. The state court also barred them from speaking to their son about their religious beliefs and human sexuality during any visitations. And now the parents are asking the Supreme Court to protect other parents from losing custody of their children over religious beliefs. You know, I thought I've seen everything till I started to see this. And when I started understanding that somebody may come in and I end up losing custody of a child as a result of my refusal or maybe what I would call good parenting, and now I have a court that's coming in and telling me that things should go this way and not go this way, even when I may believe something different from a religious standpoint. You know, Lawrence, I don't know where we're going with this. And there were times where I wish I wasn't living in my parents' house because of certain rules, but it just seems like I don't know how you parse. Where do you go with this? No abuse, no neglect, but because of your religious beliefs, somebody may come in and tell you you no longer have custody of your children.
This is your classic overreaction. This is a situation where the court took some things that, while you can give them some weight, some consideration, they just took it to a whole nother level. If you can imagine living in the heart of Texas and a family brings in a child and they have the unmitigated gall to tell that child that perhaps the Cowboys are not the best football team on the planet, though Cowboy fever runs deep in Texas. If you can imagine how ludicrous it would be to remove that child from the home because the parents had the audacity to love the Giants more than they love the Cowboys, now you can begin to appreciate just how much of a stretch it is for the court to have done here what they did. Folks, at the end of the day, the religious beliefs that get passed down from parent to child are things that will hopefully guide and influence the thought process. But having been a pastor for a long time and having been a parent for a long time, the bottom line is this: all a parent can do is put certain things out there. And when a child reaches a certain age, they're going to do what they think it's in their best interest to do. And it might be what you taught them. It might not be what you taught them, but that's true across the board. So to say that after finding no neglect, after finding no instance of abuse, to say that it is enough to relocate a child just because of a departure on this particular point, it's an overreach, and really it's an unfair bias against something that at the end of the day, we all want our children to have some type of religious influence in their life. And I tell people all the time, you don't have to believe like I believe, but I want you to believe something, because faith is a foundation and it matters.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, just the crushing of parental rights in this case is problematic as well. So, you know, as y'all have mentioned, the court found that there was no abuse or neglect, but because the parents would not affirm the child's gender identity, that was enough to remove the child and put the child in a affirming transition home, where there was also some underlying issues, including eating disorders and things like that, that actually got a lot worse after that period. And so we're taking away a loving family who doesn't agree with the child's gender identity, but has firmly grounded religious beliefs, and saying that we're not engaging on the question of the religious beliefs. They also engaged in the court engaged in restraint of telling the parents, you can't actually talk about your child's gender identity and your religious beliefs when you go on visitation. I mean, it's a pretty tragic case as you read through it, and the Supreme Court denied cert in the case. So we are, you know, we're stuck with that decision, at least for now. But this will be a future issue. One of the things that the court said is, in terms of the restraint on speech, they talked about it being a private concern, not a matter of public concern. Well, this actually is a huge matter of public concern and will continue to come up in different jurisdictions and locations.
You know, Andrew, I was kind of shocked to see this really in the state of Indiana. You know, when you start thinking about certain jurisdictions across the country, the ones that you would imagine would go in a certain direction that sometimes end up going in a completely different direction, is also a reminder to us that you really have no idea what's going on wherever you go. You know, people think that, quote unquote, they're red states, they're blue states, they're red jurisdiction, they're blue jurisdictions. When you're in a red state, you get a purple decision. You're in a blue state, you get a red decision. I mean, this was one of the most surprising decisions that I've ever seen. And cert being denied, this is kind of stuck here for a while, it looks like.
It is, yeah. It seems by all facts the detriment of this child and the entire family, right? That's the part of this that it has been most problematic for me as we've continued, especially the past 5 years, that it seems we're more worried about symbols than reality, right? There are legitimate times in which parents have abused mentally, emotionally, perhaps physically LGBTQ plus students, right? Their children, higher rates of suicide, all of this can be. But they investigated this, right? And that was not the case here. These were parents, by all accounts, trying to do the best they can, right? Loving their child in a way that they knew how to love a child and figure, but the symbol of this is more important than this child being with her parents who love her. Like, at some point, people have to matter more than the symbols we have, right, to get a win. And this seems like one of those times where the actual human beings involved had little account in this entire process. Courts and legislatures were making points for the culture as a whole, and these people are left behind.
And I agree with that. And I think, you know, it's so interesting that they're willing to say in this instance that religious training and religious upbringing in and of itself was harmful enough to this child to take them out of their home, right? So what does that say? It causes a little bit of fear in my eyes, at least, to say, okay, so now as I'm raising my kids, the state can now come in and tell me that they disagree with my religious teachings and they can take my children from me. But I do agree with you, Andrew, this is symbolism, right? This is symbolic. This is part of culture war. And, you know, gender identity and pronoun usage, it's such a hot button issue these days. And we see such a variety of how states are handling this, right? With some states banning any kind of gender affirming or care or whatnot. And we see other states going the other direction, saying basically, you know, it trumps any kind of religious teachings that parents want to instill in their children.
You know, the struggle I have with this, Lawrence, is when you take a look at it, on one hand, society tells you need to be a good parent. You need to be engaged. You need to be, you know, doing everything that you can to raise up an individual in your household to be a productive part of society. But then, on the other hand, now I have a court that's coming in saying that we don't like your parenting style, not because you've done something that's violating of the quote-unquote law in terms of what may not quote-unquote be in the best interest of the child, but this court is now saying that we think the model of you trying to pass along what you may view as important in your life, your religious beliefs, to pivot to your children, is now viewed as being, quote unquote, contrary to what the law should be.
You know, the historic posture has been that parents are granted latitude to raise their children. And however, you know, I was in the store the other day and parents came in and their smallest child, their youngest child, wanted to plop down in the middle of the floor and have a temper tantrum because he wasn't allowed to snatch something off the shelf that he wanted to snatch off the shelf. Well, my parenting said, snatch him off the floor, swat him on the behind, and help him understand that when we go out to the store, this is not how we act. But, you know, you step back and you recognize that there are different dynamics that kick in and you give them the room for that. And so the unwillingness of the government to do that here really is troubling, and it flies in the face of what has historically been the posture when it comes to dealing with cases like this.
You know, Andrew, this kind of one-size-fits-all aspect of this is also what is pretty frightening to me, because I have 3 children and I had to raise them all differently. The mere fact that we all lived in the same house did not allow me to be in a position where I could even use a one-size-fits-all with my own 3 children. But here it seems as though someone's looking at this set of circumstances and overlaying it from what I would call a governmental or legal framework to tell you how this child should be raised, which may be very different rules and standards because of who this child is.
That's right. That is not even delineated as abuse as we talk about abuse, right? And that's the troubling part of this, right? A friend of mine said, I think it's absolutely accurate, parenting is the longest long game there is, right? You're doing the best you can with what you have, and you don't really know until they become adults, and then they tell you where you messed up, right? If it is a case of parents clearly they're struggling, they're trying to do the best they can, they love their child. I mean, when it's explicitly investigated and all of that was found out, but this thing you say to your child, if you don't say it this way, we take your child. That is an unprecedented level of government overstep into the home that, again, is not. Abuse matters. We should be worried about abuse. The government should be worried about abuse. But the government explicitly said, we're not talking about abuse here. We're talking about this one issue and the way you talk to your child about it. And that type of overreach is the thing that it scares me.
You know, Jennifer, I'll give you the last word on this. You know, overreach and not being able to pass on to your children what you believe from a religious standpoint, it just seems like that is, you know, almost un-American.
No, I agree. I think that I'm hoping that this case is a one-off that will get corrected and that will be rectified, because otherwise, you know, I think that parents should be worried about the state coming in and telling them how to parent, even though we believe that parents should be given this freedom in how they raise their kids. This case seems to indicate the opposite.
Well, I got to tell you, I got to go back and rethink some of the things I said to my kids over the years and make me wonder whether or not I might have been in bigger trouble at a long time ago if this was happening today. But hopefully we can see this get righted at some point, but appreciate all your thoughts on it. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, did you know that the United States Postal Service has its own anthem, its own theme song, appropriately composed by a guy named Jack Stamp?
Did not know that. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So did you know that in a move towards inclusivity, the Boy Scouts of America have decided now, after their 114-year history, to change their name to Scouting America?
Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Our discussion today referenced this whole issue with pronouns and what we will call somebody and what we won't call somebody. Perhaps we've been treating this as a hardware issue when actually it's a software issue.
Joy, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that practicing Christians are twice as likely to foster or adopt as the general population?
Did not know that. Ladies and gentlemen, that was 4 for 4 as of what I didn't know. So great, it was good talking with you today and looking forward to doing this again. Thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.